They say a man who values honesty lives with a clean conscience. I've built my life on that principle, and until recently I thought my wife, Linda, shared that value. We've been married for 34 years. I've worked hard, provided for my family, and, as far as I knew, done right by everyone who mattered to me. We've raised 3 kids who've all settled nearby, and every Sunday they come by for dinner. It's my favorite part of the week, watching our grandkids chase each other in the backyard while Linda and I cook together. At least that's how it used to be. It's hard to describe when I first started noticing the change. Linda had always been the reserved, reliable type. We weren't flashy or extravagant. We didn't do secrets. But a few months back, I noticed she seemed more distant. She'd skip her usual Saturday morning walk with me, saying she needed time to recharge. She was still attentive during Sunday dinners, but afterward, she'd disappear to the bedroom early, saying she was tired. One morning, I was taking out the trash when I spotted it, a concert ticket sticking out of her purse. A single ticket, dated for last weekend when she'd supposedly been helping her sister at her house upstate. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. We've had a good marriage, and I know how easy it is to assume the worst. But a seed of doubt was planted. "Linda, I didn't know you liked concerts," I said casually over coffee the next day. She blinked, surprised, and then laughed, waving it off. "Oh, that?" A friend at work had an extra ticket. I thought about going, but I didn't end up making it. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but there was something about the way she said it, as if she'd rehearsed it. I didn't push further, but the unease lingered. She hadn't mentioned a friend at work before, and we've always been open about our friends. Over the next couple of weeks, little things started to add up. She started dressing differently. New earrings, a scarf I'd never seen before. I've never been one to keep track of clothing, but Linda's always dressed sensibly, so the changes stood out. She took longer showers, and when I asked if she was meeting up with someone special, she just shrugged, saying she felt like taking better care of herself. She stopped looking me in the eye. Part of me wanted to believe her. We've known each other since high school, but I kept thinking back to that ticket. I knew I couldn't let this go. Something wasn't right. After a few weeks of quietly observing Linda's new habits, I decided to dig a little deeper. The changes in her routine were too specific to ignore. She'd started going out in the evenings with friends from her old book club, and while I knew she used to be a member, I also knew she hadn't attended any meetings in years. When I mentioned it, she said they'd recently rekindled the group, and now they were meeting every other Wednesday at some new spot downtown. I wanted to trust her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than book club reunions. So, one Wednesday night, I decided to take a drive and see this meeting for myself. I drove to the restaurant she'd named, a trendy place in the city's arts district. It was an odd choice for Linda, who usually preferred small, quiet places where she could actually hear herself talk. The parking lot was packed, and from where I sat, I could see that she wasn't there. My heart sank. I sat there for almost an hour, my mind going in circles. I kept hoping she'd show up, that this was just me being paranoid. But deep down, I knew she wasn't coming. When I finally drove back home, she still hadn't returned. I couldn't just sit there waiting, so I decided to check something I'd always ignored: her purse. Linda's purse was sitting by the door, and my hands shook as I picked it up. I'd never gone through her things before. We've always had that kind of respect for each other. But that night, I felt like a stranger in my own house. Inside, I found a lipstick I didn't recognize, a small perfume bottle she'd never worn around me, and a receipt from a restaurant clear on the other side of town. Definitely not where her book club was meeting. I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it and waited. Around midnight, she finally came home, looking more flushed than I'd seen her in years. She had this excitement in her eyes that cut right through me. I stayed in the den, pretending to read a newspaper. When she saw me, she startled, almost like she'd forgotten I existed. I calmly asked her how the book club was, and she stammered, something about a great discussion on an old classic. I didn't press her, but right then I knew. She was lying straight to my face. The next morning, Linda acted like nothing had happened. She made breakfast as usual, asking me if I needed anything from the store, chatting about a new show she wanted us to watch together. She'd slip her wedding ring around her finger absent-mindedly, smiling as if the night before hadn't happened. I felt like I was in a dream, watching her play the part of the perfect wife. But I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. Her late nights, the receipt from a restaurant she'd lied about visiting, the perfume that didn't smell anything like her usual scent. I'd built my life on honesty, and I couldn't live with this deception. So, I decided I'd gather real proof before saying a word. She had an answer for everything, so whatever I found would need to be undeniable. I began with the simplest place to look: her phone. Linda never used to be secretive with her phone. It was usually tossed somewhere in the house, forgotten until she needed it. But lately, she'd started keeping it close, even taking it to the bathroom or placing it face down on the counter. So, while she was in the shower that Saturday morning, I took a chance and grabbed her phone from the dresser. The lock screen had a new passcode. Linda had never set a passcode before, and she hadn't mentioned changing it. I felt a chill run down my spine. If there was nothing to hide, why the need for a password? But I put it back, not wanting to risk her noticing anything out of place. I had no choice but to look elsewhere. That weekend, I started a routine. Every time she went out for these book club meetings, I'd check for clues. I started looking into our shared finances and found several new expenses: restaurants, a hotel reservation, gifts from boutiques she'd never mentioned. Each one stung more than the last, every piece of evidence pointing to something I could barely face. I felt a strange combination of dread and anger building up inside me. Then, on Sunday night, while she was supposedly out running errands, I got the biggest shock yet. One of her credit card statements had an entry from an upscale jewelry store. I hadn't received any expensive gifts, so whatever she'd bought wasn't meant for me. I stared at the credit card statement, feeling my stomach twist. An expensive jewelry purchase from a store we'd never been to, made on a Friday night when she was working late. She hadn't bought me a watch or cufflinks, hadn't even hinted at an anniversary gift. No, this wasn't for me. Sunday dinner came and went, but my mind was elsewhere. I could barely focus on my kids and grandkids, my thoughts spinning back to that jewelry receipt. Linda acted the perfect hostess, laughing, pouring drinks, passing out slices of her famous apple pie, as if everything was perfectly normal. I looked at her as she leaned in close to our eldest, whispering some little secret in his ear, and I felt a wave of resentment wash over me. How could she lie to me so easily? How could she keep up this charade in front of the whole family? After everyone left, I asked her how her errands had gone. She gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "Oh, just the usual running around. Nothing exciting." She didn't even blink. I couldn't hold back anymore. "You've been spending a lot lately, Linda. New clothes, new jewelry," I said, keeping my tone even. "What's all that about?" Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Well, can a woman treat herself once in a while? I've worked hard all my life, John. Just wanted to feel a little special." "Special for what?" I asked, not breaking eye contact. She laughed lightly, but there was tension in it. "Oh, just for me." Then she turned away, dismissing the topic as if it were nothing. I knew right then I wouldn't get the truth from her by simply asking. She had her story, her answers rehearsed to a T. But I was done playing along. I'd have to catch her in the act. The following week, I decided I'd need to take things a step further. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but Linda's web of lies had forced my hand. I wanted the truth, something undeniable. I knew her phone was my best shot, so I decided to wait for the right moment. That moment came one Friday evening when she was getting ready for another supposed book club night. I waited in the den, pretending to watch TV, but I could see her reflection in the hallway mirror as she put on a new dress, a deep shade of red I'd never seen her wear before. She'd fixed her hair, done her makeup with extra care. She looked stunning, but it wasn't for me. When she finally left, I gave her a few minutes, then slipped into the bedroom. I knew she'd left her tablet on her nightstand. It wasn't as carefully guarded as her phone. I picked it up, unlocked it, and went straight to her messages, hoping she hadn't erased everything. And there it was. She hadn't even tried to hide it. Her screen was filled with text from someone named M. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. Things like, "Last night was incredible and can't wait to see you again," left little doubt about what was going on. There was even a recent photo, Linda and this M sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, smiling like they hadn't a care in the world. I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. My wife, the woman I'd loved for over 3 decades, was cheating on me, and with a level of carelessness that was almost insulting. She hadn't bothered to cover her tracks, hadn't worried that I'd find out. After a while, I put the tablet down and walked back to the den. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing, trying to wrap my head around the betrayal. I could have confronted her that night, could have demanded an explanation, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. No, if I was going to deal with this, I needed a clear head and a plan. So instead, I waited. The next morning, Linda acted as if nothing had happened, just like every other day. She made her coffee, hummed a little tune, and even gave me a quick peck on the cheek as she walked by. I couldn't believe how easy it was for her to act like we were just another happily married couple. She was practically glowing, and it made my stomach turn. I knew I needed more information. I needed to know who M was and how long this had been going on. So, that weekend, I started a new plan. I'd follow her. I'd never done anything like it before, but I figured a man deserved to know the truth about his own life, no matter how bitter that truth might be. The following Thursday, she mentioned she'd be going out to help her sister with something. I watched her pack an overnight bag, wondering how many other lies she'd told me over the years. She said goodbye, and as soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my coat, took my old truck, and followed from a distance. She didn't go to her sister's, and she didn't leave town either. Instead, she drove straight to a small inn near the edge of the city. I parked across the street and watched her check in, meeting up with a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit, hair slicked back, and a smug look on his face that made my blood boil. I watched as they laughed, holding hands, completely oblivious to the world around them. They looked like they didn't have a care in the world, like they hadn't destroyed a family just to have their little fling. I didn't confront them. I simply took pictures, feeling a strange sense of calm as I documented every minute of their betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about truth. After an hour, I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts about what to do next. When Linda returned home the next evening, she was her usual self, all smiles and small talk, like she'd just come back from an innocent visit with her sister. I watched her closely, every laugh and casual remark feeling like a slap in the face. She seemed almost happier, more at ease, as if whatever she'd done was some kind of relief. And why wouldn't she be? In her mind, she was getting away with it. I knew I'd have to be careful. Bursting out in anger would only lead to excuses, denials, and probably a complete erasure of any remaining evidence. No, I wanted her to face the truth, every part of it, and to answer to everyone she'd lied to. She'd hurt more than just me. She betrayed our family and lied to friends who trusted her. That Saturday, I made a decision. At our next family dinner, I confront her in front of everyone. I wanted the people who loved us to see her for who she really was. But I needed to make sure I had everything in place first. That meant gathering every last piece of evidence. I spent the next few days preparing, printing the photos, saving screenshots of her messages, and arranging them neatly in a folder. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances around Linda, acting as if everything was normal. Every day felt like a performance, but I kept my head down, knowing the truth would soon be out in the open. When Saturday evening finally came, I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest. Linda cooked up her usual spread, smiling warmly as our children and grandkids arrived, completely oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. The dinner started out just like any other. Linda was in her element, passing dishes around, laughing with the grandkids, and sharing little updates from her week. I could hardly look at her. The thought of what she'd been doing with that man, and how she could just sit there, lying to all of us, made my blood boil. But I kept calm, knowing that tonight, the truth would finally see daylight. Once everyone had finished eating and the kids were busy playing in the living room, I cleared my throat. I have something I'd like to say. I started, my voice steady but loud enough to catch everyone's attention. Linda looked up at me, surprised, a hint of confusion on her face. "Dad?" our eldest son asked, sensing the tension. I took a deep breath, glancing around the table at our family, each face looking back at me, waiting. I didn't want to bring this up here, but I feel like you all deserve to know what's been going on. This affects everyone, and I don't see any other way to do it. Linda's face went pale. John, what are you talking about? She asked, trying to force a smile, but there was a tremor in her voice. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, placing it on the table. I could see Linda's hands trembling slightly as she realized what was coming. Linda, I said, looking her dead in the eyes, I know about your affair. A collective gasp went around the table. Our youngest daughter, who'd been chatting with her husband, froze, her mouth open in shock. Linda tried to sputter something, but I held up my hand, stopping her. I know everything, Linda. I know about your trips, the late nights, the jewelry, I said, pushing the photos across the table. Here's proof of where you've been and who you've been with. So, if you'd like to explain yourself, go ahead. We're all listening. Linda's face drained of color as she looked down at the photos. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She glanced around at our children, who stared back at her in shock, waiting for her to say something. Linda's eyes darted around the table, landing briefly on each of our children, and then back to me. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in a broken whisper. John, please, can we talk about this privately? She asked, her face full of desperation. I shook my head slowly. Privately? You didn't keep anything private when you brought this man into our lives. You lied to all of us, not just me. So, I think it's only fair that we handle this openly. One of our sons, Michael, turned to her, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt. Mom, is this true? You've been seeing someone else? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Our daughter, Sarah, was in shock, hands covering her mouth, her husband's arm around her shoulders as she stared at her mother in disbelief. Linda's eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something, but no words came. The weight of the silence in the room felt almost unbearable, pressing down on all of us. Finally, she choked out, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you, John. Unhappy, I repeated, the word almost bitter on my tongue. So, you chose to betray our family instead of talking to me? You were unhappy, so you lied to me, to your children, and to everyone who ever trusted you. Linda dropped her head, staring at her hands as she fumbled for something to say. But it was too late for explanations, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite the story. This was about her choices, her lies, and the pain she'd caused each one of us. Our daughter's voice broke the silence. Mom, you lied to us? To all of us. Her voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. How could you do that? Linda looked at Sarah, her own tears spilling over. She tried to reach across the table, but Sarah pulled back, her face full of betrayal. Our youngest son, David, who had always been close to Linda, looked at her with a pain that I'd never seen before. The whole family, the people she'd loved most in this world, were now looking at her as if she were a stranger. Please, just listen, Linda pleaded, her voice shaky. I never wanted any of this to happen. I felt lost, out of place. I don't know how it started, but her voice trailed off as she tried to piece together an excuse, a story that would somehow make sense of her actions. I didn't have the patience to listen to her rationalize what she'd done. You felt lost, so you decided to destroy your marriage and lie to your family? I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. You think this justifies sneaking around, lying to me and to everyone else? For what, Linda? A thrill? A second chance at life? She looked down, clearly cornered. Her shoulders shook, and she dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I thought maybe I deserved a little happiness, a little something for myself. After all these years of doing the right thing. She glanced around the table, as if seeking some understanding or forgiveness. Mom, you had happiness, Michael said, anger now evident in his voice. You had a family who loved you. How could you just throw that away? Linda looked at Michael, her expression changing to one of shame. I know. I was wrong, so wrong, and I know it. But I didn't know how to stop, she whispered, voice breaking. I stood up, unable to sit through any more of her justifications. Well, Linda, it stops now, I said firmly. I'm done listening to lies. You've had plenty of time to come clean, and yet you didn't. Her head dropped, and she was silent. The truth had finally come out, and now she had to live with the consequences. I glanced around at our children and their spouses, all stunned and hurt, their expressions saying more than words could. I felt the weight of each person's gaze on Linda, and as painful as it was, I knew this confrontation was the only way forward. The silence around the table felt like it stretched on forever, and in that moment, I could see everything Linda had risked, everything she'd thrown away for whatever fleeting satisfaction she thought she'd found. Our family, once bound by trust and loyalty, now sat fractured, unable to understand what she'd done. I finally looked up at her, my voice steady but cold. "Linda, I want a divorce." The words hit her like a blow. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. She looked around the table, perhaps hoping one of our children would come to her defense, but they were all too stunned, too heartbroken to speak. They didn't see their mother anymore. They saw someone they barely recognized, someone who had shattered the foundation of their family. Linda reached out, as if touching my arm could somehow take back all the damage she'd done. "John, please don't do this. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but we can get through this. We've been together for 34 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of her betrayal press down on me. "It meant everything to me, Linda. I devoted my life to this family, to you. But you decided that wasn't enough. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to plead with me. "John, please, I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling. I'll tell you everything. Just don't end it like this." Our daughter, Sarah, spoke up, her voice laced with bitterness. "Mom, why should Dad forgive you? You didn't just lie to him. You lied to all of us. We trusted you." Linda looked at Sarah, her face crumpling in anguish, but she had no defense. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You'll hear from my lawyer, Linda," I said quietly. "And I'll be taking steps to make sure that everything we built stays with the family." With that, I walked out of the dining room, leaving Linda and the stunned silence behind me. I spent that night alone in the guest room, my mind racing through memories of our life together. Every vacation, every holiday, every quiet Sunday morning. Each one felt tainted now, colored by the betrayal I'd uncovered. I lay there, feeling the kind of heaviness you only feel when something you loved and trusted has been shattered beyond repair. Over the next few days, Linda tried everything to get me to speak to her. She left notes on the kitchen counter, little apologies written hastily in her shaky handwriting. "John, please give me a chance to explain. Let's just talk for the kids' sake." She called my phone a dozen times each day, leaving voicemails full of teary apologies and promises to change. But each time, I ignored her. I couldn't listen to her voice, couldn't hear the same mouth that had lied to me now pleading for forgiveness. The betrayal had gone too deep, and I didn't see a path back. Our children were a mess too. Sarah called every night, struggling with the shock of what she'd learned about her mother. Michael and David dropped by often, trying to wrap their heads around how the woman they'd trusted could have caused so much pain. Each one of them had questions I couldn't answer, and they were left grappling with the same disbelief I felt. Linda's betrayal didn't just tear us apart as a couple. It shook our family to its core. Finally, after a week of silence, Linda asked me to sit down and talk. "For the sake of the family," she said. She'd always been skilled at appealing to my sense of duty, and even now, I couldn't help but feel a tug of obligation. So, I agreed to meet her in the living room, bracing myself for whatever excuse or justification she would try to offer. Linda sat across from me, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, eyes red-rimmed from a week of tears and sleepless nights. She took a deep breath, her hands wringing together as if she were trying to hold herself together. "John, I know you're hurt, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice wavering. "But please, I just want you to understand. This wasn't about you. I was just lost." I let her speak, but my mind went blank as she tried to explain her actions, throwing out phrases about finding herself and feeling trapped. Every word felt hollow, each sentence empty and self-serving. It was clear she wanted to cast herself as a victim, as someone who had simply made a mistake. But I wasn't buying it. I'd spent too long feeling blindsided, and now all I could feel was anger. When she finally finished her speech, She looked at me with hope in her eyes, waiting for me to respond. I took a deep breath, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "Linda, there's nothing left to say. You betrayed me. You betrayed all of us. I don't want an explanation, and I sure as hell don't want excuses. What I want is a divorce, and I want it quickly. You can keep explaining yourself, but it won't change a thing." Her face crumpled, and she began to sob, but I stood firm. She had chosen this path, and now it was time for her to walk it alone. After our conversation, Linda moved into the guest room, respecting my request for space. It was as if we were strangers now, passing each other in silence. The once warm, lived-in feel of our home had turned cold and empty, every room echoing the broken trust between us. For the next few weeks, she tried to speak to me, tried to wear me down with apologies and promises, but I ignored her, steeling myself each time she tried to reach out. I had no room left for her words. When I met with my lawyer, I was clear. I wanted a straightforward divorce, nothing drawn out. I wanted the house, a fair portion of our savings, and custody of any memories we'd made as a family. Linda had been reckless enough to sign her own fate. She'd taken everything we'd built together and thrown it into the fire. Now she'd have to face the consequences. Meanwhile, Linda made her own attempts to regain her footing. She went to our children, pleading for their forgiveness, trying to rebuild bridges. She tried to remind them of their childhood, the time she'd cared for them, but they saw through her desperate attempts to rewrite history. Even Michael, who had always been the most forgiving of the three, grew distant, taking calls from her less often and leaving her messages unread. Linda also suggested counseling, an effort to work through the pain and find healing. She said it was for the sake of the family, that even if I couldn't forgive her, I should at least try to help her fix what was broken. I told her that she'd already broken everything beyond repair and that her attempts to put it back together only underscored how little she'd valued it in the first place. One day, I came home to find her in the kitchen, looking at old photos spread out on the counter. She pulled out our family albums, pictures of our wedding, the kids as toddlers, vacations by the lake. She looked up, eyes glassy with tears, and said, "John, don't you remember all we've been through? Doesn't any of it matter?" I looked down at the photos, the evidence of a life we'd built. "It did matter, Linda," I replied, voice as calm as I could muster. "But you threw it all away. All those memories meant something to me, but now they're just moments in a life you decided to betray." The silence that followed was heavy, and I could see in her eyes that she finally understood the permanence of what she'd done. But I was done explaining. The paperwork was filed, the legal wheels were turning, and soon enough, this chapter would close. As the weeks passed, the divorce process moved forward. Linda's attempts to stop it dwindled, and I think she realized that she was no longer in control. She'd lost me, and the reality of what that meant seemed to be sinking in. Our children stayed distant, keeping their interactions with her limited to brief, polite calls. Any trust she had with them was as fractured as it was with me. Then came the community fallout. News of her affair had quietly spread around town, and though I hadn't intended to make a spectacle of her, small-town gossip had taken its course. Friends who used to greet her warmly at the market or the cafe now barely acknowledged her. I knew this was tearing at her, being stripped of the social life she'd cherished for so many years. I could see it in her defeated posture, the way she moved through the house in silence, a shadow of the woman she once was. One day, she came to me with a desperate proposal. "John, I know there's no fixing us, but maybe we could work something out," she said. "Maybe we don't have to go through with the divorce so publicly. We could just live separately like roommates. Keep the peace for the family." I stared at her, amazed at how little she seemed to understand. "You're asking me to pretend that everything's fine? To keep up appearances while you live some half-life here?" I shook my head. "Linda, this isn't about keeping peace for the family. It's about you facing the reality of what you've done. You can't erase the damage by hiding from it." She dropped her gaze, her face a picture of resignation. "I just don't want to lose everything," she whispered. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you threw it all away," I replied, my voice hard. "This isn't something I'm willing to sweep under the rug for your comfort. You chose this path, Linda, Now you'll walk it to the end." After that, she stopped suggesting ways to fix things. The silence in the house deepened, and Linda seemed to shrink a little more each day. As the divorce neared its conclusion, she kept mostly to herself, barely making eye contact when we crossed paths. The woman who once commanded every room she walked into was now a ghost in her own home, a reminder of the life she destroyed with her own hands. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I never imagined that the end of a marriage could feel this cold, like closing a door on an old life. Linda was quiet during the final proceedings, signing where she was told, her face unreadable. She'd asked for very little in the settlement, perhaps out of guilt, or because she'd realized that nothing she could take would bring back what she'd lost. I kept the house and most of our shared assets. She walked away with just a small portion of our savings and the promise of a quiet departure. As she packed her things, she tried once more to reach out, but this time it felt more resigned than pleading. "John, I know I've said this 1,000 times, but I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't change anything, but I wish I could go back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her, feeling a surge of anger tempered by a strange sense of pity. She was already living with the consequences, and I knew she'd carry them with her, probably forever. "Linda, we all have to live with the choices we make. You chose your path, and I chose mine. There's no going back. Not for you, and not for us." She nodded, a look of final acceptance crossing her face. And with that, she gathered her things and walked out the door. I watched her go, feeling an unexpected sense of closure. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted to a new rhythm. Life was quieter now, and while there was still pain, it was a different kind of hurt. The house, though full of memories, now felt like my own, a place where I could start fresh. My children remained supportive, calling more often, stopping by for dinners like they used to. They, too, were finding their own ways to move on. Our family dinners had taken on a new tone, more somber, but filled with a sense of loyalty and resilience. Linda reached out occasionally, sending cards to the kids and calling on birthdays, but she remained distant, keeping her interactions brief and guarded. Our children maintained polite but cool contact, a reflection of the trust she'd shattered. She had become, in many ways, a stranger to us all. As I moved forward, I found a surprising strength in the silence. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also revealed something I hadn't realized before: the capacity to rebuild. I discovered that the truth, painful as it was, had set me free to start anew, to live life on my terms with honesty and integrity. And that, I decided, was worth more than all the years I'd lost. Months passed, and as the seasons changed, so did I. Life had a different texture now, one that felt both unfamiliar and oddly liberating. My days fell into a new rhythm, one marked by moments of reflection, small joys, and a gradual acceptance that sometimes people, even those we trust the most, make choices that change everything. Linda had moved to a small apartment on the edge of town. I heard from our kids that she kept mostly to herself, working part-time at a nearby bookstore and attending a few local church gatherings. She tried to piece together a new life, but without her family's warmth and our shared history, I imagined it must have felt like living in the shadow of her own mistakes. Our family began to heal. Sunday dinners, now held in my home, became a time of bonding, a testament to the resilience of the family we'd built. My children were stronger, more independent, and although they kept a certain distance from their mother, they had found a way to move forward, just as I had. We leaned on each other in those early days, creating new memories that weren't weighed down by the betrayal that had once fractured us. Over time, friends and neighbors stopped whispering about the scandal, and life in our town returned to normal. Occasionally, I'd run into someone who knew Linda and me, and they'd ask if I ever planned to forgive her, if reconciliation was possible. I'd tell them that forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. I had forgiven her in my own way, finding peace in accepting the past for what it was. But reconciliation? That required trust, a trust that had been irreparably broken. There were days when I felt the ache of loneliness, of course, especially during the quiet evenings. But even those feelings came with a silver lining. I'd found strength in myself I didn't know I had, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Free from deceit, from half-truths, from a life that had been built on a crumbling foundation. Now I was finally standing on solid ground, and the life ahead of me was mine to shape as I saw fit. One evening, as the sun set over the fields behind my home, I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon, looking out over the landscape, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I thought about everything that had happened, the life I'd left behind, and the new one waiting for me. And in that quiet, in the soft orange glow of the setting sun, I understood something clearly. Sometimes, endings are the only way to find a new beginning.